Native Americans have inhabited Mexico since about 14,000 years ago. Between 7,000 and 10,000 BC, corn and beans, staple foods of the region, were also domesticated there. This set the stage for the advancement of Mesoamerican civilization, which developed over the next several thousand years leading up to the people known as the Olmecs. This highly advanced society was the precursor to other groups such as the Maya people. In the 8th century AD, an era known as the Late Classical period by experts on Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization was in a state of decline in areas around southern Mexico and Central America, such as Palenque, Tikal, and Copan. The decline of these city centers continues to baffle archaeologists and historians. But other Maya cities in the Yucatan Peninsula, such as Chichen Itza, began to grow and flourish. In the 900s AD, the Toltec Empire in central Mexico was becoming very influential. The Toltecs developed an extremely sophisticated system of government ruled by a class of nobility, which extracted tribute from the various cities it controlled across the region. However, the Toltec Empire collapsed in the 12th century after a series of wars with nomadic Chichimeca tribes from the north. The Toltec Empire then broke up into numerous states, which continued to be ruled by leaders whose bloodlines descended from Toltec nobility. In 1325, the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica, founded their capital, Tenochtitlan, in what is today known as Mexico City. Aztec rulers revered the ancient Toltecs of central Mexico, and they claimed to have shared ancient noble bloodlines with them. And like the Toltecs, the Aztecs ruled over much of central Mexico, and their influence was felt as far away as Central America. They also exacted tribute from across the region in the form of goods and people, whom they used for ritual human sacrifice. In 1521, the Aztecs were conquered by Hernan Cortez, a Spaniard who led a small expedition of just a few hundred men, but was accompanied by tens of thousands of indigenous allies that had long been hoping to topple the Aztec Empire. During Mexico's colonial period under Spanish rule, the natives who resisted Spanish colonization effectively had no rights at all. However, the Spaniards did have a much more nuanced relationship with their indigenous allies. Because the natives had never been exposed to Islam and other religions deemed to be heretical against Christianity, Native Americans had what was called purity status under Spanish law. According to colonial era laws, a race of people who knew Christianity and rejected it became impure. But if you had never heard of Christianity, you still had the potential to be quote-unquote enlightened, and thus baptized into the faith in a state of purity. In other words, accepting the Spanish king and becoming Catholic made indigenous communities pure in the eyes of Spanish law. In Spanish colonies, the only ethnic groups that were allowed to elect their own leaders and have a degree of self-government were Spaniards and Catholicized Native Americans, and these two groups lived in segregated towns throughout Mexico. Even so, the mixed-race children of natives and Spaniards lacked many rights in both communities. These people were known as mestizos. In the first few decades of the colonization of Mexico, there were very few mixed people, but this changed over time and new ethnic groups developed according to their level of admixture with Spanish, indigenous, and African ancestries. It's almost hard to imagine that the flow of people and the exchange of goods between the Iberian Peninsula and the Americas has never ceased since 1492. In school, we learn very little about the events around Christopher Columbus's journey to the New World, and we learn much less about the Spaniards who joined him. Since that expedition never reached Mexico, the connection between us and them is not readily apparent. But for many Mexicans, tracing your ancestry back to Spain oftentimes cuts right through the Caribbean. The Caribbean islands are also a key part of the story of the conquest of Mexico. In 1453, the Islamic Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, the most formidable Christian capital on the eastern edge of Europe, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire and ushering in the close of the medieval period. The fall of the East exposed Western Europe to new dangers. Perhaps even more dire was the fact that it cut off Christian Europe from important trade routes into Asia and to the Middle East. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the success of the Iberian Catholic armies led by Castilla and Aragon in pushing back Muslims further and further south offered new hope to the Vatican and neighboring Christian kingdoms. As success was surely on the horizon, Castilla was already formulating plans to chart the oceans beyond its borders. And why wouldn't they? Neighboring Portugal was already experimenting with funding expeditions in the Atlantic. In 1476, a man believed to be from Genoa, which is located in modern-day Italy, shipwrecked off the coast of Portugal. While in the country, Christopher Columbus found his way into elite circles, and by the following year, he was navigating ships on behalf of the Portuguese, sailing as far away as Iceland. In 1486, after being rejected by the King of Portugal, Columbus met for the first time with authorities in Spain and presented them with the proposal to sail across the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Asia. The idea was appealing, and within just 4 months of defeating the Moors, Castilla eagerly signed an agreement which offered Columbus particularly favorable terms, even by the standards of the times. In exchange for his services, Castilla offered Columbus the position of viceroy. A viceroy is someone who governs a jurisdiction as a representative of a king or a queen. This type of jurisdiction is known as a viceroyalty. In his first trip to the Americas, Columbus reached the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, where he established the Colombian viceroyalty, which was the very first legal jurisdiction of this kind in the New World. This same governing model was used to establish the viceroyalties of New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and Rio de la Plata, once those lands were conquered. The Spanish government also agreed to fund 90% of the cost of the expedition. This might have been too high a price to pay for Portugal, which likely explains why they declined his proposal. Columbus's governing style was considered to be tyrannical, even in his own time. On the island of Hispaniola where he governed, extreme working conditions, food disruptions, and disease decimated the native population, and Spaniards who rebelled or spoke out against Columbus's poor leadership were executed. Ultimately, the Genoese explorer was arrested, sent back to Spain, and stripped of his governing responsibilities. It was around this time that an 18-year-old Hernán Cortez arrived in Hispaniola. Having studied law at the University of Salamanca, he could read and write during an era in which most Spaniards were illiterate. And now that the glorious wars against the Moors on the peninsula were over, the Americas offered a new avenue for a young man to attain upward social mobility. By this time, the Crown of Castilla had gotten much more serious about creating an orderly society, as the scarce resources and false expectations raised tension in the region. Cortez arrived not to the paradise he had expected, but instead, he came to a society in ruins, a place where unruly settlers failed to establish meaningful relations with the native inhabitants. It was at this time that a new governor was appointed, and he arrived with supplies, religious leaders, experts in agriculture, livestock, and other items necessary for recreating Spanish life in the Americas. This next phase of colonization was also when Spanish women began permanently moving to settlements in the Caribbean. Cortez was a young man with no actual combat experience. He might have had some training in firearms and swordsmanship, and he certainly knew how to ride a horse. But like many men of his generation, he hadn't actually been on a battlefield. But at 20 years old, he was appointed to pacify Hispaniola in order to get the situation under control. Given these circumstances, a complete mess created by a wave of settlers before him, he likely came to realize that his training in the art of negotiations could have avoided the complete chaos generated by unmitigated brute force. In 1511, an opportunity to move up was presented to Cortez when he was offered the position of head of military operations to conquer Cuba, but he declined. Instead, Cortez later convinced the newly established governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, to appoint him as treasurer, a request the governor granted. This role put Cortez in a position to get to know the most important people making their way to the Caribbean. Following the expeditions of Christopher Columbus, the Spaniards began to establish permanent settlements all across the lands in and around the Caribbean, including Cuba. In 1510, a crew of Spaniards also established the colony of Santa Maria la Antigua del Darién, which was in Panama. In 1511, the crew, among them 16 Spaniards and 2 indigenous women, set sail from their Panamanian settlement en route to the island of Hispaniola, but along the way they shipwrecked on the island which is now known as Jamaica. From there, they hopped in a smaller boat that they had on board and set sail for Cuba, only to crash land in the Yucatan Peninsula. Some died on this perilous journey by sea, but the survivors of this voyage were captured by a Mayan tribe, divided up as slaves, and handed off to local elites. Some may even have been sacrificed. In the end, only 2 Spaniards are believed to have lived long enough to make their way out of slavery. One was Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Catholic deacon, as well as a man named Gonzalo Guerrero. Aguilar was sent away to Tulum, where, as fate would have it, he was assigned to be a servant of a Mayan priest. In time, he became fluent in the Yucatec Mayan language. As for Guerrero, he was sent to Chetumal, which was another Maya city that spoke the Yucatec language. Guerrero was held in slavery, but in time he earned his freedom, after which he married Sacil A, the daughter of his Mayan lord, Nachancan. The Spaniard and his wife had 3 children together, creating the first mestizo children on what is now Mexican soil. In 1518, Cortez was living in Cuba. He was originally from Extremadura, a region of southern Spain. Like Cortez, many Spaniards were from this area of Spain and other parts of the southern side of the Iberian Peninsula. And many of these Spaniards that moved to the New World in the first 100 years of colonization passed right through the Caribbean. So as you're doing your Mexican genealogy, there's a good chance you'll trace your ancestry to one of these first settlers. Cortez's legal expertise and natural charisma would later serve him well as he made his way through central Mexico, setting up towns for Spanish settlers, forming alliances, and establishing Mexico's colonial government. Like all other Spaniards, Cortez was in search of gold and other treasures. In an era where Spaniards had no form of currency to trade with the natives, he and his team produced green-colored glass beads, which to the Spaniards were nearly worthless, but to the natives they conjured up curiosity. During his expedition, Cortez would later trade these glass beads for gold and other valuables with the natives. Cortez was given orders by Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, to only establish trade relations with the people of the mainland, but the ambitious expeditionary captain quickly developed much bigger plans for himself once he reached Mexico. While still in Cuba, there were reports that shipwrecked Spaniards were stranded off the coast of the Yucatan. Cortez and his crew intended to see if the rumors were true. On the 19th of April, Cortez and his expeditionary force departed Cuba in 11 ships and arrived off the eastern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula on the island of Cozumel. Just a few days later, while on the island, the Spaniards engaged with native tribes, and they actually helped them track down Jerónimo de Aguilar, one of the shipwrecked Spaniards. Cortez exchanged glass beads with the tribe in order to secure Aguilar's freedom. Aguilar's ability to speak Yucatec Mayan would later turn out to be one of the greatest weapons in the Spanish arsenal. After retrieving Aguilar, Cortez sent members of his crew, including Aguilar, to get Guerrero from the village where he was now living. Upon reaching the village, Aguilar attempted to persuade Guerrero to leave the village and join Cortez's expedition, but Guerrero rejected him, saying, "Brother Aguilar, I am married and have 3 children, and they look on me here as a cacique and captain in time of war. My face is tattooed and my ears are pierced. What would the Spaniards say about me if they saw me like this? Go, and God's blessings be with you, for you have seen how handsome these children of mine are. Please give me some of those beads you have brought to give them, and I will tell them that my brothers have sent them from my own country." And that was it. Guerrero stayed behind with his adopted Mayan community. From there, Cortez and his crew sailed around the peninsula toward central Mexico's east coast. On March 12th, 1519, Cortez and his men landed in what is today known as the state of Tabasco, near the town of Potonchan. They encountered a hostile tribe, known as the Maya Chontales. The indigenous community signaled for them to leave the region, so the Spaniards held back in a safe area, but that night they planned an attack. A few Spaniards were assigned to scout the area leading up to the community. The Spaniards decided to launch their attack from an area known as Centla. At the time, the Chontales were governed by a cacique named Taabscub, and it is believed that the name of the modern state of Tabasco is derived from the name of this Maya chieftain. Prior to the battle, Cortez sent Aguilar to read the requerimiento to the members of the tribe. The requerimiento was a statement calling on enemy forces to surrender and pledge their loyalty to the King of Castilla and to the Catholic Church. This type of statement was actually adopted from a similar practice performed by Muslims according to their religious laws while Spain was under Islamic rule. In this battle, around 12,000 Chontales faced off against Cortez's forces of about 16 cavalrymen and 550 foot soldiers. The indigenous forces were outmatched by Cortez's muskets and cannons. But perhaps more importantly, the Spaniards on horseback were the most decisive factor, as this was the first time indigenous warriors ever encountered horses on the battlefield. In the end, the Chontales were defeated, marking the first Spanish victory in Mesoamerica. Following the battle, the Chontales sent some ambassadors to engage with the Spaniards in order to defuse the situation and to establish peace with the invading foreigners. The Chontales also took an oath of allegiance to the King of Castilla and celebrated Mass together with the Spaniards. Also, these indigenous ambassadors brought with them a number of items, including gold and jade, animal skins, and food. Additionally, they handed over 20 young enslaved women. Among them was a woman named Malintzin, also known as La Malinche. Malintzin was an intelligent woman who spoke multiple indigenous languages, including her native language Nahuatl, as well as Yucatec Mayan. And sources describe her as being the daughter of a ruling indigenous family from central Mexico. In time, she also learned to speak Spanish. Although it's not exactly clear how she ended up in captivity by the Chontales, it's likely she was either kidnapped or sold into slavery. Very shortly after Malintzin was added to Cortez's expedition, it became clear that she and Aguilar would become Cortez's most important advisors. On April 21st, the Spaniards reached a tiny island they called San Juan de Ulua, and on the following day they went to shore and encountered two Aztec ambassadors, both of whom were from a nearby village. And this was the first time members of the Aztec Empire formally met with Cortez's expedition. In this exchange, Aguilar was unable to communicate with them because he couldn't speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. However, during the conversation, Malintzin revealed her ability to speak the language, and she assisted Aguilar by interpreting from Yucatec to Nahuatl. Cortez provided the ambassadors with 2 shirts, gold belts, some garments, and other small items, and requested that they return with their chieftains so that he could speak with them. The next day, the 2 emissaries came back with their local chieftain. Through his interpreters, Cortez told the chieftain that he came in peace, but that the people of the village would need to submit to the King of Castilla and become his vassals. Perhaps baffled by these mysterious figures, the chieftain quickly agreed. Because of the goodwill in which the Spaniards were received, Cortez dressed the chieftain in fine linens, a coat, a gold belt, and also promised that the Spanish king would soon bestow favors on him. A day later, the chieftain returned with his own gifts for Cortez. Among them were precious gold ornaments. It was in these interactions that Cortez began to realize that these strange new lands might offer the riches that his team had hoped to find. After meeting with these indigenous leaders, the Spaniards decided that there was no going back, and they established the first official Hispanic settlement in what is now Mexico. The settlement was called Villarrica de la Veracruz, from which the modern state of Veracruz derives its name. In doing so, Cortez's expedition attempted to legally separate itself from the authorities in the colonial government of Cuba, and this newly established town council appointed Cortez as both the chief justice and captain of the Royal Armed Forces of the new settlement. The authority of the expedition in Mexico now fully rested in Cortez. While Cortez and his men were still in Villarrica de la Veracruz, another group of indigenous people approached the Spanish encampment, but this tribe appeared to be from a different community. Through his interpreters, Cortez learned that this group referred to themselves as the Totonacs. They were eager to get to know these new arrivals, but more importantly, they had some issues that needed to be resolved with a neighbor that had brought them great misfortune. In June, Cortez left 150 soldiers and 2 horsemen behind in Villarrica de la Veracruz, and set out with 15 horsemen and 300 foot soldiers for the province of Zempoala, the capital of these Totonacan natives, where he met with their chieftain, whom the Spaniards later described as El Cacique Gordo, the fat chieftain, to reference his husky appearance. When speaking with their leadership, Cortez explained that he was sent by a powerful king to this new land. Upon hearing this, the Totonacan leaders told the Spaniards that they were under the yoke of an oppressive tyrant by the name of Moctezuma, who forcefully took their children away to be sacrificed. Their province had as many as 30 Totonacan towns and fortresses, as well as 25,000 residents, but they were unable to liberate themselves from their Aztec overlords. Cortez promised that in exchange for their submission to the King of Castilla, he would offer them protection. It was a bold offer considering the size of the tribe and the scant resources the Spaniards actually had to offer, but the leadership of Zempoala agreed. This new alliance grew the ranks of the Spanish forces, who were eager to meet Moctezuma and see his capital. While the Spaniards were still in the town, 5 Aztec tax collectors appeared and went directly to the Totonacan leadership demanding tribute and to know why they allowed the foreigners into their capital. As punishment, the Aztecs asked the chieftains to hand over 20 residents to be offered up for sacrifice. Upon hearing this, Cortez called on the Totonacan leadership to arrest the tax collectors and to refuse to pay the taxes. When the tax collectors were imprisoned, the Spanish captain actually met with them, but pretended to have no knowledge as to why they were captured. In an act of trickery, disguised as goodwill, Cortez told the tax collectors that he would request the Totonacas to release them. Cortez did so, and then told the 5 Aztec men to return to the Aztec capital and tell their emperor that he was planning to go in peace to visit him. When the tax collectors arrived in Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma, who was already aware of the Spaniards' arrival, was preparing his forces to confront Cortez. However, when the tax collectors explained that he had set them free, the emperor decided to return the favor by sending gifts to the Spanish visitors. This cunning act provided the Spaniards with 2 important tactical wins in their campaign. They curried favor with the Aztec emperor and put the Totonacan leadership in a dangerous situation that prevented them from backing out of their alliance with Cortez. By solidifying this relationship with Zempoala, the Spaniards also brought its 30 Totonacan settlements under their dominion. This was the first formal military alliance between the Spaniards and an indigenous community. The Totonacas suggested to the Spaniards that they should also attempt to form an alliance with the Tlaxcalans, the mortal enemies of the Aztecs. Cortez then went back to the town of Villarrica de la Veracruz that the Spaniards had recently established. During this period, Cortez learned that there were men in his expedition who were still loyal to Diego Velázquez and were planning to return to Cuba. Cortez was no longer acting in accordance with the orders issued by the colonial governor, so any return to Cuba could have led to his arrest or even execution. In an effort to circumvent Velázquez and his loyalists, he ordered some of his men to sail in one of their ships to Spain with a letter and some gold. His intention was to gain legitimacy for his expedition from the King of Spain. Additionally, he rounded up the conspirators and had 2 of them hanged, and another had his toes chopped off. In a death-defying move, he also ordered his men to sink the remainder of their ships so that no one else could plan an escape. In August, they returned to Zempoala with 400 soldiers, 30 riflemen, 15 cavalrymen, and 40 to 50 men with crossbows, where they stocked up on supplies and recruited 800 Totonacan warriors, including some of their chieftains, to join them on their trek to Tenochtitlan. Many of these new indigenous allies served as porters who carried supplies and artillery for the expedition. While passing through the province on their way westward toward Tlaxcala, they stopped in a few towns that were within the Aztec dominion. Cortez later wrote in a letter to the King of Castilla that he was well received by the locals and provided with lodging. While staying in the village of Sautla, another of Moctezuma's vassal states, Cortez had a conversation about the Aztecs and their capital. Olintecle described Tenochtitlan as a grandiose metropolis whose houses were built above water, and further stated that its only entry points were accessed through 3 causeways that connected the island to the mainland. The cacique continued to say that Moctezuma was a mighty lord, and from his description of the city, it seemed all but impossible to conquer. When he described reserves of gold, silver, and other treasures within the city, the Spaniards grew more eager to witness it with their own eyes. Indeed, throughout central Mexico and beyond, there was no ruler more powerful than Emperor Moctezuma. After hearing these words, Cortez explained that he himself had been sent at the behest of a ruler that was much more powerful than even Emperor Moctezuma, and that he intended to turn the ruler of Tenochtitlan into a vassal of Castilla. The Spanish king, he continued, had commanded Cortez and his expeditionary forces to compel Emperor Moctezuma to give up robbing local towns, seizing more lands, and sacrificing his vassals. Cortez also asked the cacique to forego the practice of human sacrifice as well. The Spaniards then began to prepare to head to Tlaxcala, where they had planned to stop before continuing on to Tenochtitlan. The Totonacas mentioned to the Spaniards that the province was not far away from where they were. There was a wall made of stones in the distance, and that, the Totonacas stated, was the border separating Sautla from Tlaxcala. When Cortez asked the Sautlan chieftain which direction provided the best route to the Aztec capital, Olintecle suggested that he pass through Cholula rather than Tlaxcala. But the Totonacas warned the Spaniards that the Cholulans were a treacherous people who were allies of the Aztecs. Emperor Moctezuma also kept a military garrison in that city. Instead, the expedition should continue through to Tlaxcala as planned, the Totonacs stated. Cortez trusted his Totonacan companions and ordered his forces to continue on to Tlaxcala, as they suggested. The Spaniards then sent forth 2 indigenous messengers to inform the Tlaxcalans of their plans to visit. However, when they entered Tlaxcalan territory, the Spaniards and their Totonacan allies did not receive the warm welcome they had expected. As they made their way through the area, they ran into their 2 indigenous messengers, who were taken as prisoners by the Tlaxcalans. The messengers had tried to explain to the province's leadership that the Spaniards and Totonacs were hoping to form an alliance, but the Tlaxcalans believed that the Spaniards were working on behalf of Moctezuma. They even rejected rumors circulating among the natives that the Spaniards were divine beings. The Tlaxcalans were a courageous and strong people. Contrary to popular belief, they actually fought against the Spaniards before forming an alliance with them. The Tlaxcalans share part of their ethno-history with the Aztecs, in that both groups, along with 5 other Nahuatl-speaking tribes, are said to have emerged from Chicomostoc, the 7 caves. In the first week of September, the Spaniards and their recently acquired indigenous allies entered Tlaxcalan territory, which was located east of modern-day Mexico City. And for the next few weeks, they fought intense battles against the Tlaxcalans before finally getting them to surrender. On September 23rd, Cortez and his men entered the Tlaxcalan capital victoriously. Around this time, Aztec ambassadors traveled to Tlaxcala to meet Cortez, and they witnessed the Tlaxcalans in their defeat. Cortez met with Tlaxcalan leaders who explained that they initially believed that the Spaniards had entered on behalf of Emperor Moctezuma. They said their lands were regularly pillaged by the Aztecs, and that they had no gold or jewels to offer since they were reduced to extreme poverty. They were also landlocked and had very few options for obtaining salt and other food products. The Tlaxcalan leadership then began to provide details about the layout of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, including its entry points, aqueduct, population, and its immense amount of wealth. When asked by Cortez how they had avoided being conquered by the Aztecs, they responded that they had a few neighboring allied communities, as well as other informants in towns that were under the Aztecs' control, so they were able to prepare whenever an attack was imminent. And it was in these exchanges that the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans agreed to an alliance. And because of the Totonacs, whom they met on the coast and had guided them to the Tlaxcalans, the Spaniards now had safe passage and positive relations with all native towns from Villarrica de la Veracruz all the way to Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans also offered 5 daughters of noble lineage. This was done according to Tlaxcalan customs to solidify the alliance. It's very important to note that these relations were key to the success of Cortez in Mexico, and many, or even most, historians would agree that the conquest of Mexico could not have happened without the help of the indigenous people who allied with Cortez. The alliance between the Tlaxcalans and Spaniards lasted for the next 300 years, and together during that period they conquered territories as far away as Central America, South America, the Philippines, and what is today the American Southwest. While still in Tlaxcala, Cortez discussed with his crew which was the best route to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. Moctezuma's 4 ambassadors, who had traveled to Tlaxcala to meet the Spaniards, urged Cortez to pass through Cholula, since the town was in the Aztec dominion, and they could provide better lodging for them. But the Tlaxcalans countered those suggestions by telling Cortez that that would be dangerous. In doing so, the expeditionary force could open itself up to an ambush by Moctezuma's men. Instead, they should pass through the town of Huejotzinco, a town southeast of Tenochtitlan, in the modern state of Puebla, where the people were friends of the Tlaxcalans. In the end, Cortez decided to take the road through Cholula, despite the dangers, because the city was larger and offered more options for stocking up on supplies. They also just wanted to see the city since in the distance, its large pyramids and towers could be seen. And in some ways, the magnificence of the cityscape reminded them of towns back in Spain. While discussing these matters, 4 new Aztec ambassadors arrived bearing gifts for the Spaniards. And in their discussions with Cortez, They said that Moctezuma was very much surprised that the Spaniards were in the company of Tlaxcalans, a people, they continued, who were so wicked and treacherous that they were not even fit to be enslaved. Sooner or later, the Tlaxcalans would betray the Spaniards, the Aztec ambassadors warned. All of this was done to undermine Cortez's new relationship with the Tlaxcalans, because Moctezuma was well aware that an alliance between these foreigners and his worst enemies could turn into a disaster for the Aztecs. Cortez thanked the ambassadors and expressed his friendship to them. He also stated that he would soon make his way to the Aztec capital. Shortly thereafter, Cortez then sent messengers to Cholula, asking the city's leaders to travel to Tlaxcala to meet him. But this was of no use. The Cholulans wouldn't dare to enter Tlaxcalan territory. So Cortez and his men, including some Tlaxcalan warriors, made their way to Cholula. At the time, Cholula was one of the largest cities in the Aztec Empire. The city was a center of commerce, as well as spirituality, within the empire. It was also known for its reverence to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, associated with knowledge, the planet Venus, and art. The city also had a large temple in honor of Tlaloc, a Mesoamerican deity associated with rain, fertility, and water. On October 14th, Cortez and his men entered into the city of Cholula. The people of Cholula were not nearly as hospitable as those in previous towns. Also, the Tlaxcalans were not allowed to enter and had to remain outside the city. Even so, the Totonacs were permitted to accompany the Spaniards, and they gathered intel on the city for the Spaniards once inside. Within just a few days, the Cholulans stopped providing food to the Spaniards, and they turned even more cold in their attitude towards them. Moreover, the Totonacan allies began noticing what appeared to be the preparation for an assault, as they found newly dug pits in the streets and noticed that women and children were fleeing the city. Malinche, who was one of Cortez's trusted interpreters, also heard of a plot to attack the Spaniards while speaking with the local woman. A few days later, Cortez gathered all the leaders of the city on the pretext that he was planning to bid them farewell. But once he had them all together, he explained that he knew of their plot to attack the Spaniards and their allies. The Cholulans stated that the plot to ambush the Spaniards was ordered by Moctezuma, but these words were of little use. Before long, Cortez signaled for his men to attack. As the Spaniards and Totonacs fell upon the mostly unarmed Cholula nobles and city leaders, the Tlaxcalans ran in to ransack the city. Thousands of Cholulans were killed, and this was by far the worst massacre that had occurred since the Spaniards arrived in Mexico. In the midst of this chaos, the Spaniards loaded up on treasures, but also liberated prisoners from cages who were being held to be sacrificed. The attack sent shockwaves to the leadership in Tenochtitlan. From there, the Spaniards and their allies marched to the Aztec capital without any further interference from Moctezuma's men. On November 8th, 1519, Cortez and his men met for the first time with Emperor Moctezuma, who came to meet the foreigners right outside the Aztec capital. Moctezuma was accompanied by the lords of Texcoco, Iztapalapa, Tacuba, and Coyoacan. He was dressed in fine linens and was decked out in gold and other treasures. He also had a massive number of servants accompanying him, and they placed cloaks on the floor so that his feet would not touch the ground. There was also a multitude of residents all around who came to see the meeting of these two leaders as they met on the causeway, which was flanked by the waters of Lake Texcoco and whose passage led directly to the city. There were also people in boats on both sides, while others were on rooftops. Cortez handed Moctezuma a necklace made of green beads, but when the Spanish captain attempted to embrace him, Moctezuma's bodyguards moved in to stop him. Cortez then thanked the great emperor of Tenochtitlan for the hospitality he showed to him and to his men. The Spaniards were then led to some accommodations that were prepared for them within the city. After getting settled in, Cortez and some of his men dined with the Aztec emperor. During the discussion, Moctezuma stated that he was aware of previous voyages to Mexico's coastline by other strangers in the years prior, and was curious to know whether the others were with Cortez. The Spaniards confirmed that those explorers were some of their compatriots. Moctezuma then apologized for having had some hesitancy in bringing Cortez to the capital, since some of the city's residents feared that they were angry deities. But he could see now that they were flesh and bone. He also noted that he himself was also a mere mortal. He also explained that his ancestors prophesied the coming of people from the east who would reign over his empire. He believed Cortez was the one they predicted. In this exchange, the Spanish captain explained some of the details of his religion, clarified further that they were just mortals like the Aztecs, and stated that he was sent by a mighty king. Cortez went even further. He stated that he was one of only many who would soon come and call on the Aztec emperor to submit to the king of Castilla. Cortez then decided to not take the conversation any further. In the following days, the Spaniards spent much of the time within the palace where they stayed, but they also had a chance to explore the city and see the robust market in neighboring Tlatelolco. Cortez then asked Moctezuma to allow him and some of his captains to ascend up to the top of the main temple of the city, which had two altars dedicated to the Aztec deities known as Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. Once they had all made it to the top, Cortez asked for permission to erect a cross, but the Aztec emperor and his native priests angrily rejected the proposal. Following these episodes, the Aztecs' attitudes towards the Spaniards began to grow more cold. The Spaniards could feel that the situation was taking a turn for the worst, and their paranoia began to set in. Cortez's men were growing worried that they were trapped within the city amidst powerful warriors and angry chieftains who grew more impatient with them as the days went on. Then one day, some Tlaxcalan messengers brought word that the Spanish settlement in Villarrica de la Veracruz was being attacked by local natives loyal to Moctezuma. On November 14th, Cortez and a few of his captains went to Moctezuma's palace and confronted him about the attacks and also the plot to kill them while they were in Cholula. Moctezuma denied everything. Even so, Cortez had Moctezuma apprehended and brought to the palace where the Spaniards were staying, and there they kept him on house arrest. Out of shame for his circumstances, Moctezuma told other leaders in the city that he had moved to the Spaniards' residence on his own free will and continued to conduct city business there as if nothing were the matter. This situation continued on for months. In May 1520, Cortez and some of his men had to travel back to Villarrica de la Veracruz because a Spanish fleet of 19 ships and 1,400 men had arrived on the east coast of Mexico, and they were sent by the governor of Cuba, who was looking to put an end to Cortez's expedition. The fleet was led by Pánfilo de Narváez. Cortez gathered up 266 Spanish soldiers along with 10,000 Totonacan allies. At the time, Narváez had set up camp in Zempoala, the Totonacan capital. In a sneak attack, Cortez and his allies ambushed Narváez's men, killing 5 of them and forcing them to surrender. Narváez was then arrested, and the rest of his men joined Cortez's expeditionary force. In the midst of these events that transpired, an African slave brought by Narváez named Francisco Eguía, who was infected with smallpox, came into contact with local natives. This is the first documented case of smallpox on Mexican soil, and it spread immediately across central Mexico and beyond. Smallpox, along with a type of salmonella brought possibly via European livestock, were the 2 main causes of a collapse in Mexico's population. There is no consensus on the actual number of pre-colonial natives in Mexico. Some put the number as low as 5 million, while others have estimated as many as 25 million people. What's more clear is the low point of the population. The number appears to have bottomed out around the year 1620 to between 700,000 and 1.2 million people. In any case, Spanish writings at the time reported entire towns almost being completely depopulated as a result of illnesses. Many residents also likely fled in order to avoid military conflict. In the mid-1600s, the native population began to rebound, and by 1810, the year Mexico declared independence, the native population was just under 4 million, which was about 60% of Mexico's population at the time. Today, Mexico's native population has reached 25 million people, and as many as 93% of Mexico's entire population has some level of native ancestry. While Cortez was still dealing with Narvaez on the coast, Pedro de Alvarado was left in charge of the Spaniards in Tenochtitlan. During this period, there was a growing dissension in the leadership of the Aztecs. There was a faction of nobles who disagreed with Montezuma's approach in dealing with the Spaniards and wanted to expel them from the capital. On May 22nd, 1520, between 600 and 1,000 festival participants were preparing to perform a ceremony in honor of their god Tezcatlipoca for a festival known as Toxcatl near the main temple of the city. During the festival, the Aztecs brought out a young man to be sacrificed. This sparked an angry reaction from the Spaniards, who were already in an agitated state for having been in the capital for far too long. This was also an opportunity for them to loot the precious jewels and gold that the Aztec priests were wearing. Once the sacrificial victim was brought out, Alvarado ordered his men to attack the largely unarmed crowd. Nearly every single person was killed in this unexpected hostility, and all of this was done while Moctezuma was still under house arrest inside the palace where the Spaniards were staying. When Cortez returned to the capital, the Aztecs were in complete revolt against the Spaniards. The situation had gotten so bad that the Spaniards could no longer leave the palace in the city where they had been staying out of fear that they might be killed. Each time they left the palace hoping to make an escape, they came under attack from the Aztecs. The fighting was so intense that Spaniards who had been in military conflicts in Europe against the French and the Turks said that they had never encountered such intense fighting. Amidst the uproar, Cortez brought out Moctezuma so that he could speak with the angry crowd. A number of them stopped throwing objects and settled down to listen. Moctezuma said to them that if they had just stopped, the Spaniards would leave the city. In this exchange, some in the crowd stated that they chose a new leader, whose name was Cuitláhuac and was the lord of Iztapalapa, and he was chosen to replace the great Moctezuma. Moctezuma's pleading was of no use. The Aztecs were no longer willing to be placated by the Spaniards or Moctezuma. They had witnessed their capital occupied for the past 7 months, and they were disappointed that their leader was so weak and ineffective in navigating the situation. Some in the crowd began throwing stones, and one of them hit Moctezuma in the head, which later killed him. On the following night, Cortez and a number of Tlaxcalan allies, who were cooped up in the city with him, made an escape under the cover of darkness. Even so, on their way out, they suffered heavy losses. As many as 600 Spaniards were killed trying to escape the city, and more than 1,000 Tlaxcalans were also killed. This was the worst defeat suffered by the Spaniards up until this point. However, while on their march back to Tlaxcala, the Spaniards scored a massive victory against the Aztecs in the Battle of Otumba, which provided them with enough of an opportunity to reach the Tlaxcalan capital, where they could regroup and stock up on supplies. Cortez and his men spent the next several months in Tlaxcala, and during that time, smallpox was sweeping across central Mexico. It even killed the Aztecs' new leader, Cuitláhuac, and he was replaced with an 18-year-old man named Cuauhtémoc, who was the nephew of Moctezuma. Cuauhtémoc is regarded in Mexico as the last official pre-colonial leader of Tenochtitlan. In the meantime, Cortez began solidifying his alliances with the most powerful native communities in central Mexico. The shakeup in Tenochtitlan's leadership caused a schism among Aztec nobles. At this point, Cortez already had the Totonacs and Tlaxcalans in his camp, but he also added the people of Cholula, Huejotzinco, and other towns. But the crown jewel of these new allies was Texcoco, a town that was at the core of the Aztecs' power base, which sat strategically on the eastern side of Lake Texcoco. They were in a dispute with the Aztec leadership over the appointment of Cuauhtémoc as the new leader of Tenochtitlan. This was enough of a schism for Cortez to exploit and bring Texcoco's leadership over to his side. The Spaniards were now determined to make war on the Aztec capital. Also, for the first time, many of their allies were themselves united with one another. Prior to 1519, Many of the communities in central Mexico resented being under the control of the Aztec Empire, but also had hostile relationships with one another, even though they were similarly subjugated by Tenochtitlan. Cortez recognized these divisions across central Mexico and positioned himself as a neutral broker among these diverse groups. The Spaniards and their allies set up camp in Tlaxcala, and it was there they planned out their logistics to attack Tenochtitlan. Cortez devised a plan to capture the city that was perhaps unparalleled in history at the time. In his expeditionary force, there were men who were educated in the most advanced techniques in the art of shipbuilding, and Cortez ordered them to design 13 brigantine ships that they could use to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. Together, they began cutting down trees for wood, and they brought pieces of their ships back from the coast. When the elements of the ships were ready, more than 8,000 Tlaxcalan men helped to carry the pieces to Lake Texcoco, where the ships were assembled. The Aztecs also tried to put together an alliance to defend the capital, but some of their neighboring groups, such as the Purépechas in Michoacán, rejected the proposal. The walls were now closing in on the Aztecs. As part of a last stand, they barricaded themselves on the island. Cortez and his men then launched his newly assembled fleet in Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs fought back by unleashing their own warriors who attacked the ships from canoes, but before long, the Spaniards made it to the island. The Spaniards also damaged the Aztecs' main aqueduct, which provided water to the city. But perhaps the determining factor that spelt doom for the Aztecs was not the Spaniards themselves, but the European diseases that came along with them. While the diseases also impacted the indigenous allies of the Spaniards, the Aztecs were much more vulnerable since their position on the island prevented them from gaining reinforcements, as their warriors were dying from war and disease. Even so, the Aztecs mounted a brave defense of the city until every square inch was conquered. On August 13, 1521, the war ended when Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured and formally surrendered to Cortez. This marked the beginning of Mexico's incorporation into the Spanish Empire, an era which lasted for the next 300 years.